Hey everybody, it's 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and you're listening to Chopping It Up with Keith Saarloos, and this is part 2 of our multi-part series with Dennis Patrick, former chairman of the FCC, worked in the Reagan White House, and last we were talking was the breakup of AT&T, and talking about monopolies, and let's take it from there, because one of the things that you were talking about, and while we were saving this, you know, everybody gets up and goes to work every single day of their life, and some people want a lot of government in their life, and some people want a yellow line painted on the road, and that's my perfect level of government, right? It's like I don't really want to think about it, but there are so many people working in so many agencies that are really dictating how our life is going to be on a daily basis. And we were just discussing on the last episode, FCC. The breakup of running cable to people's homes in rural communities, the breakup of a huge monopoly of Pac Bell and AT&T. Let's just continue the conversation. I mean, one of the things I wanted to hear more about is being in those rooms and making these decisions. How do some of those things, how does that come down the pipe? Do people have pet projects that they say, well, I've always cared about this and now I want to get involved in it? Or is it you're taking them as you come and you're making the best decisions you possibly can? Because I think of the government as just regular people trying to make a great decision. This is what I hope for anyway. Making a great decision that benefits everybody who lives within these borders that calls themselves an American.
Well, you touched on one really interesting issue or I should say process point. I think that there are a number of people in Washington who do sort of take it as it comes. You know, issues are presented, the issue needs to be resolved, and you move on from there. Then there are those who come into office saying, hey, these are the things I see that I think could be better, and they come in with an agenda. In my case, when I became chairman, I sat down with my staff, and we actually left Washington and had a little bit of a retreat, and we said to ourselves, if we've got, I think there were 2 years left in the Reagan administration when I became chairman, if we've got roughly 2 years to run this quite consequential agency, what would we like to accomplish? So we were very conscious of that, and we basically came up with 4 or 5 things that we wanted to see accomplished by the time that we left office.
What were some of those things?
Further deregulation of the broadcast industry. Last week we didn't even get to broadcasting, but broadcasting was an equally large part of the agenda that we dealt with when I was at the commission. So deregulating broadcasting was one of the things we wanted to do.
What was it like at the time?
Well, at the time, a couple of things were amiss as far as we were concerned. There were significant restrictions on cross ownership, first of all, and what that means is that if you owned a broadcast station, you couldn't own a cable station, and if you had one station, you couldn't buy a second station, and there were restrictions on ownership, and they were, honestly, when they were created, they were well motivated. The idea was you didn't want a single company or even a single individual controlling all of the quote-unquote voices in the community.
Is that a holdover from, say, Hearst, where they owned all the newspapers? They could put whatever they wanted in the paper, and they could actually drive policy and drive public opinion?
That was the idea. That was the fear. And so, yes, I mean, it was a holdover of that fear, although there are significant distinctions between the print media and the broadcast media, which is something we'll get into a little bit later, I'm sure. But there were a lot of regulations with respect to cross ownership that probably made sense when they were first enunciated, but as the industry changed, it became difficult for instance, a small AM radio station to compete in the media marketplace without some economies of scale and without some synergies that they could drive by having, for instance, the adjacent FM station and maybe even a second station, or maybe they have a television station. The concern was that you wanted to have a diversity of voices, But what we were experiencing in the 80s and then continued in the obviously in the 90s and beyond was this massive proliferation of voices. So we didn't really, our view was that the problem is no longer the number of voices. There's a multiplicity of voices being added to the mix of the debate of public policy. New cable channels. I mean, when I first went to the commission, cable was, we touched on this last week a bit, an antenna service. By the time I left, it was 30, 90, 60, 100, and now, even more channels.
So we kind of went from 1984, where there was one, and I don't mean that by the year, but the book, where there was one voice, one channel, one this, to Brave New World, where there are a million different things, and you can find someone to listen to that has your exact opinion and will solidify it.
Well, exactly. And so one of the changes we made was to loosen up some of those regulations. We wanted our kind of guiding light was diversity of opinion, diversity of voices, and competition. So what happens in Washington, especially at regulatory agencies, is the regulatory agency becomes captive to the regulated
Culture capture.
Culture capture and captured by the parties that you're supposed to be regulating. So AT&T, for instance, before divestiture and before we introduced competition into the industry, which they were not happy about.
They were the only game in town.
They were the only game in town. So they had a cozy relationship with the FCC. I mean, basically, we were their cartel manager. They had a cartel. We managed the prices.
Who's more important at that point?
And how could we, this small, sleepy little agency of 2,000 people, possibly know whether their tariffs were correct? They had 1,000 accountants to every one that I had working for me when I was chairman. The answer is we couldn't. But there's one thing that can bring a company under control, and that's competition.
Yeah.
And that's why we lowered all the barriers to entry and we created competition. But getting back to broadcasting, there were a number of things that were hampering the industry. One was a lot of cross-ownership rules. The other was rules that made it difficult to start new stations or to expand a cable operation, et cetera. Our bias was always in favor of add more voices to the community, and then we will have to regulate even less. However, there was one additional very large constraint on the behavior of broadcasters and on of the electronic media generally, and that was something called the Fairness Doctrine. So
is that equal time?
It's equal time for basically. I mean, there are some distinctions, but
I'm a layman.
Yeah, but in layman's terms, it's equal time for ideas. So believe it or not, when I became chairman in 1987, well into the Reagan administration, so I became chairman in 1987. There was a regulation called, misnamed the Fairness Doctrine, which basically allowed the FCC to make judgments about the content of speech, and not just the content of speech that broadcasters may be airing on their stations, but the content of speech on the most important public policy issues that were being debated within the broadcast community. So it was basically equal time for ideas and debate and news and information about important policies.
Can I ask you one question about that? And I'm trying to fast forward this a few years. We all went through COVID, and one of the things that was very interesting to me during that time were if you were on Twitter and you said the wrong thing, you could get kicked off Twitter or silenced.
Right.
If you had a contrary opinion to narrative, you could be silenced. It was a wild time at the time. Is that a little bit of what you're talking about, but that was happening on broadcast television? And I'm just trying to track with you here a little bit, because if everybody is on, this is hard to say, but if everybody's on the quote unquote right team, then that is a narrative coming down from the top and being broadcast out to a lot of people. If it's in the hands of a regime or a person who is weaponizing empathy, is that They could use that for good, and you can use that for evil. Those are two different places, and it just depends whose mouth it's coming out of.
Right.
Is that kind of what you're talking about here?
Well, those issues that you identify are yes, they're kind of related to what we're talking about here. I mean, they're certainly in that same zone. The broad question, whether you're talking about the internet and what happened during COVID, or we're talking about broadcasting. What I was talking about was the broadcast community, back in the late 80s, is whether or not speech is free, or whether or
that's
not,
what I was asking about.
Whether or not speech is filtered and regulated by the government. Now,
that's exactly the point I was trying to push.
And but Keith, it gets tricky because one has to distinction between government regulation, government having its finger on the scales of public policy debate, versus private sector individuals just having an opinion and believing that this is the opinion that ought to be aired. What the First Amendment says is that Congress, and by indirection the FCC, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech or of the press. Congress. Now, that doesn't mean that you, as a free individual here in the great county of, or the great city of San Ynez or Solvang, can't have your opinion.
Sure.
You're entitled to your opinion. That's what the First Amendment protects.
Correct.
And if you didn't like what I was saying right now, I would defend unto death your right to shut me up and cut my microphone off.
Exactly.
That's what the First Amendment does. It
allows... not cut your microphone off. I mean, I think that's the point of it is one of the greatest, virtues. It is the First Amendment.
Right.
It's number one on the list.
But what people
we don't have to agree.
It's the single most. It is the foundational freedom. The First Amendment is the foundational freedom.
And a lot of people don't realize we're one of the only countries in the world that actually, like, if you live in England, there is no First Amendment.
There's no First Amendment.
There's no First Amendment really.
You can be jailed for expressing an opinion that is thought to be offensive vis-a-vis, some topic.
Correct. So that is a very rare thing in this world. And we're the first country in the history of the world that made that a inalienable right.
Right. And absolutely foundational right to all of our other freedoms. The right, I would argue that the right to vote, the right to exercise our electoral franchise is meaningless if we cannot debate as a free people the issues and the candidates that are running in that very election. Freedom of thought. What does it mean that you have freedom of thought if you can't express those thoughts to another individual? So it's clear. It goes without saying the First Amendment is a foundational right. But let's put ourselves back in my chair in 1987.
Having to make a decision about this.
In 1987, when I became chairman, there was a regulation on the books of the FCC that provided that broadcasters, and I paraphrase here, but basically it said that broadcasters shall have an affirmative obligation to cover controversial issues of public importance, which, by the way, broadcasters should. I think that's a good idea.
Journalists should investigate.
And yes, but the second half of that is where we get into trouble. And she'll cover both sides in some sort of fair and appropriate way. Again, that may be a good idea. The problem is it fell to the FCC, which is to say it fell to the federal government to make a decision about when broadcasters were covering controversial issues of public importance in an appropriate way, but more importantly, when they were covering both sides of the issue, whether it was the war in Vietnam, the war in Iraq, abortion, whatever, the federal government had its thumb on the scales of debate of the most important public policy issues that we have at the time. Now, I'm obviously I get a little animated about this topic. Think about if that rule existed vis-a-vis the printed press. it would be thrown out and found unconstitutional in 20 seconds. I mean, if you said to the New York Times, oh, by the way, we really don't like that article. You should balance it with this article over here. Or we don't like your editorial page. You should change that and take a pro or con position vis-a-vis the issue. Clearly, that would be unconstitutional, first because of the First Amendment. Well, the history of broadcasting was a little bit different. The history of broadcasting was that, well, you know, this is the right to use radio waves is a privilege that is being granted by the government, to it, the FCC. That was our job. We licensed broadcasters and do to this day, and therefore. It is appropriate, we believe, to condition that license on certain public interest obligations. Again, you have to, in my mind anyway, you have to distinguish between what is appropriate policy as a broadcaster, and I think it's perfectly appropriate to cover controversial issues, and in fact to air both sides of the issue. What is not appropriate and what is prohibited by the First Amendment is the federal government to tell you how to do that.
Correct.
And that's what we were doing. And broadcasters were at risk of losing their license if they violated the FCC. So what happened? Well, presidents as early as John Kennedy and later Nixon would have their loyalists bring Fairness Doctrine complaints against broadcasters who were not covering them or their tenure in office or their campaign in a way to their liking. So it was exactly what the founding fathers feared, that is, that the government would become involved in an attempt to influence the debates that were going on among free people. So when I became chairman, the Fairness Doctrine had been challenged by a broadcaster, brought a lawsuit and said, oh, by the way, this violates the First Amendment. And it went to the D.C. Circuit. The D.C. Circuit heard the case and remanded the case to the FCC and told the FCC to examine the constitutionality, to examine this challenge, which is, say, the constitutionality of its own doctrine.
It's kind of a Supreme Court moment for the FCC.
It was a Supreme Court moment for the FCC. And this remand order was on the chairman's desk on the day I became chairman. And
Day one.
My predecessor was not sympathetic to the Fairness Doctrine, but hadn't gotten around to addressing the issue. So I directed my staff to conduct an inquiry, a public inquiry, where we would take testimony from broadcasters, we'd take testimonies from the public, we'd take testimonies from the ACLU, anybody that wanted to come in and give us data around the effect of the existence of the Fairness Doctrine. The Supreme Court had addressed the constitutionality of the Fairness Doctrine many years ago, and they found it to be constitutional. But they dropped a footnote in that decision, and they said, this is our decision today. Broadcasting was in a very different place at the time, but were we to see evidence that the net effect of the Fairness Doctrine was a chilling of speech, it's tended to suppress speech.
And I don't mean to stop you here, but yeah. I do have a question just to kind of bring it down to a little bit of a layman's term, because we are getting in the weeds a little bit. My thought was, I can understand why somebody would put that in practice originally, where, hey, if we hear this side, we get to hear the other side. Mm-hmm. I think in any form of debate, right? That's exactly what you want to hear.
Right.
When the government steps in and says, wait, you printed this, you wrote your opinion about this, we need to hear the contrary opinion, right, and forces you to do it.
Right.
What was the ramifications? What happened after?
And thank you for tugging on the reins there. I was getting a little bit into the weeds.
No, I'm fascinated by this.
Let me say more broadly that what we found, the effect of when we took all this testimony, what we have found the effect of the Fairness Doctrine was to suppress the amount of coverage of controversies because no one wanted to be sued.
Okay.
Said something, I'm not going to cover. I'm not going to touch abortion because I'll get sued by 15 people and I might lose my license.
Yes.
So our solution was first of all, to honor the First Amendment that says the government should not be involved in the content of speech, period, end of story.
It sounds like you're trying to make your job smaller. I mean,
we were always trying to make our job smaller because we believe that the market and free people, free to express themselves freely, could manage themselves better than could the federal government. So we abolished the Fairness Doctrine. It was a very controversial decision, most controversial of my tenure.
That seems to be one of those watershed moments in American history, right? And I thank you for sharing so much of it and hearing the in-depth aspect of like what was going on behind the scenes and why you were doing that. Because as a regular modern day person, it's interesting to hear all of these things when there was a time there was 3 channels and there was a time where, this was what was on the radio and that was it.
Right. Well, can I just let me just forgive me just to interrupt there because
no, we're gonna have another we're gonna have another segment after this one. So keep going.
It's a very important point because one of the things that influenced our decision very much was the fact that since the Fairness Doctrine had been considered by the Supreme Court many years before.
And what year was that it was created? Roughly?
The commission was created in the 30s.
Okay, that's perfect.
And so it goes back many years. And the Fairness Doctrine came along it was always an FCC policy. It was never codified.
But that's amazing. 50 years. 50 years.
It was an FCC policy. And when it was challenged, I addressed the issue straight up. We took testimony. We found the net effect was to chill speech. But getting back to the point that you just touched on, one of the things that was material to our decision was the fact that there had been this explosion of voices.
Yes.
You have to be a little bit more worried about whether the public is hearing both sides if there's only 1 or 2 people talking.
Right. Exactly.
But if you've got literally thousands of voices with the internet and with the proliferation of broadcast stations, which we facilitated, then that concern is not as high. But in addition, and I remember testifying, my tail was drugged before the Congress several times to be beaten up for making this decision. And I remember saying...
It's like a bloodbath.
It was a total bloodbath. And I was...
That's terrifying.
I was the one bloodied. Or at least that was the intent. But I remember when I was being quizzed by John Dingell, who was a very powerful member of Congress, chairman of the Commerce Committee at the time, a liberal Democrat from Michigan, hell of a nice guy, but a bit of a bully when he was,
got to get reelected.
Had his chairman gavel in his hand. And he was excoriating me about this decision. And at the end of the day, what I said was, and it's what I believe to this day, for better or for worse, our founding fathers staked our all on the proposition that we are better off when the citizens are free to express their opinions. Mm-hmm. The worst thing that we can do is to have the federal government filtering our speech. And therefore, it was unconstitutional. And it doesn't matter whether you or I disagree about whether it's good or bad policy. In a sense, it doesn't matter because until you change the First Amendment, it precludes the federal government from filtering speech.
You bring up an interesting point, and I'm trying to think of it because I like to think of myself as triangulating my news, right? Me personally. I like listening to one side, I listen to another side, and then kind of find a third point of view and try to find out what's the truth in the middle of it. Because one of the things I've come to realize in my life is, as you're listening to a radio station, even right now, what my father said it to me really quite young, which is the commercials pay for the television station. It's what they put on in between the commercials is what keeps you watching in between the commercials. And I never really realized that until I was quite young and I was kind of thinking through that. And when you have a era of, you could say, from Carter to Reagan, from Reagan to Bush, Bush to Obama. There are these different changes in policy, and the American government changes based upon the choices of the American people.
Right.
And what I'm hearing from you is, at one point, that power was too strong, and the proliferation of voices means more people get heard and more opinions get shared. And when more opinions get shared, people can make up their own minds.
Right.
And by making up your own minds, by not being force-fed or quote-unquote having an illusion of choice, you now actually have a choice because you can hear a dissenting voice on a totally different station expressing their rights openly without fear of being sued because it was a law, and people could step up to the microphone and say their opinion freely without fear of federal prosecution. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct. And broadcasters, when I'm much older than you, but when I was growing up, I remember that first of all, news was 15 minutes, between 7 and 7:15 every evening, number one. And number two, it tended to be pablum. It tended to be very, very plain vanilla. And the reason was we had a Fairness Doctrine, and, the people who were running that station and who had literally hundreds of millions of dollars, if now we would say billions of dollars, invested in these broadcasting properties, they're not going to put that property at risk in order to go out on the limb and present their view or one side of a controversial issue because they could get sued on the fair. When we abolished that, we created the freedom for stations to take positions. Now, I get this all the time. I'm going to complain here a little bit, Keith.
Sure.
People say to me all the time, well, yeah, but now, we've got Fox on one side and we got MSNBC on the other side, and, you've got the left and the right, and things are so divisive. And the implication being that that's my fault because I abolished the Fairness Doctrine, which did attempt to create a rule. It did, in fact, articulate a rule that said every station had to cover both sides. But my response to that is twofold. Number one, it violates the First Amendment, and that's kind of the end of the conversation, because until you change the First Amendment, the government cannot interfere with the content of speech. But the second answer is really a more important one. We are not divided because Fox can take one position and NBC can take a different position. We are divided because we're divided. I mean, the American people have, we are in the midst of a great debate within this country about the appropriate approaches to various policy questions. We're not divided because of what someone says on TV. We're divided because we're divided. And what those various stations are doing is reflecting that division.
So if I take that position, one of the things I would say on a different side of that, or a third side, would be if you want to hear one opinion, you turn to this channel. And if you want to hear a different opinion, you hear this channel. And you listen and trust your own compass on what you want to believe.
Yeah, exactly. It's what you said before. It's triangulate.
Yeah.
There is an obligation on us as citizens to not just listen to one perspective, but to seek out a number of perspectives. So coterminous with, or coincident, I should say, with the abolition of the Fairness Doctrine, we were doing everything that we could to multiply the number of voices. We approved the entry of Fox as the fourth network.
Yeah.
We facilitated the proliferation of cable channels, satellite distribution, and we haven't even touched on the big revolution, which was when...
Perfect. Actually, this is a perfect place to stop because, number one, you've been listening to Crazy Country on 105.9. I'm here with Dennis Patrick, former chairman of the FCC on our humble little radio station, one of the only independent radio stations that is left in California. This has been an amazing conversation. I'm going to have all these pieces on Chopping It Up with Keith Saarloos on my personal podcast, so you can listen to episode 1, 2, and now 3. We're going to get into the digital revolution. So this has been Keith Saarloos on Crazy Country 105.9 with our guest, Dennis Patrick, former chairman of the FCC, and we will be back next week to talk about the digital super boom.